All right, so today we're going to be tackling Security Guard Supervisor interview prep. And I have to say, this is a topic that I think a lot of people could use some help with um, because it's a position of leadership, and there are some unique challenges that come with that.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And it's a role where you really need to be able to think on your feet
Right.
and, show that you can handle those high pressure situations.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with this? We've got a lot of resources from RoleCatcher. Their AI can help tailor answers, and there's a whole career guide for this too. But let's start with the interview itself. Like, what kind of questions should someone expect going into this?
Well, one of the most common questions you're likely to hear is, can you describe your experience in leading a team of security guards?
Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward. Like, how do you stand out with an answer to that?
It's not enough to just say, I was a good leader. You have to show them how you were a good leader.
So give me an example.
Sure, let's say you implemented a new training program that really improved your team's efficiency. You could say something like, I noticed our incident response times were lagging. So I developed a new training program focusing on communication and teamwork. And this actually led to a 15% improvement in response times, which, made a real difference in our ability to handle those tough situations.
That's much better than just saying I'm a good leader. But what about follow-up questions? Like, what if they ask about challenges you faced as a leader?
Right. That's where you show them you can handle the tough stuff. Be honest, talk about a real challenge you faced, but always spin it in a positive light. So, for example, maybe you had a team member who wasn't following protocol.
Okay.
You could say something like, I had a team member who was struggling with consistency, but instead of just reprimanding them, I really focused on coaching and mentorship. I tried to identify their strengths and help them understand the importance of those procedures. And eventually, they actually became one of my most reliable team members.
That's a great example. It shows that you're not just a boss. You're actually invested in your team's success. And I think interviewers really pick up on that. Okay, so we've tackled the leadership question. What other kind of questions should we be ready for?
Well, another important area is making sure that all those security protocols and procedures are being followed by the team. So the interviewer might ask you something like, how do you ensure that all security protocols and procedures are being followed by your team?
Right. That's all about being organized and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. You want to highlight your proactive approach. For example, instead of just saying, I monitor compliance, you could say, I implemented a daily checklist system. We used a mobile app to track things like patrol rights, equipment checks, and incident reports. And this system not only ensured 98% compliance with those safety protocols, but it also gave us valuable data that we could then use to identify any areas for improvement.
Okay, so you're not just enforcing the rules. You're actually putting systems in place to make sure they're being followed consistently. But what if someone isn't following protocol? Like, how would you handle that?
That's a great question, and it's a very likely follow-up. So you don't want to just say, I discipline them, right? Instead, you want to highlight your communication and problem-solving skills.
Makes sense.
So you could say something like, I believe in addressing issues directly, but with respect. So I would first have a private conversation with the team member, understand their perspective, and then reiterate the importance of that specific protocol. And then, if the issue continues, I would, of course, follow our established disciplinary procedures. And always document everything for transparency.
Documentation is key.
Yeah.
Now, I know security situations can get pretty intense. So how do you handle those high-pressure moments? What kind of questions are going to get at that in an interview?
Well, they're definitely going to want to see how you handle the heat. So a question you might get is, can you describe a situation where you had to handle a security threat or emergency?
Okay, so this is where you get to tell a story.
Exactly. But choose a compelling story, one that really highlights your ability to stay calm, assess the situation, and then act decisively.
So what kind of story could we use here?
Well, let's say you encountered a trespasser, someone trying to gain access to a restricted area.
Okay, that's a good scenario. How would you describe your actions?
Well, instead of just saying, I apprehended the trespasser, you could describe it like this. I noticed an individual attempting to tailgate an employee into a secure area. So I calmly approached them, identified myself, and requested that they leave the premises. But when they refused and became aggressive, I followed our protocol for de-escalation, while simultaneously notifying law enforcement. And in the end, the situation was resolved safely, and the individual was apprehended by the police.
Wow. So you stayed calm, you followed protocol, you worked effectively with law enforcement. That's a really strong answer. Now, I'm guessing they'll also want to know how you make sure your team is ready for anything.
Oh, absolutely. They might ask something like, how do you ensure your team is properly trained and equipped for different scenarios?
Right. So it's not just about basic training, it's about ongoing development too. How would you approach that?
You want to think beyond just on-the-job training. So you could say something like, I assess my team's needs regularly, and then I identify areas where they might need additional training or certifications. And then I develop a training plan that includes online courses, in-person workshops, and even scenario-based simulations to help them prepare for all kinds of situations. You know, everything from fire safety to active shooter response. And I also encourage them to pursue relevant certifications to just enhance their professional development.
So you're showing that you're really invested in your team's growth, which I think is something any interviewer would appreciate. But with technology changing so rapidly, how do you keep your team's training relevant?
Well, that's where you have to stay ahead of the curve. I mean, you could say that you subscribe to industry publications, you attend conferences, you participate in online forums, just to stay informed about the latest trends and technologies. And then you could say, I share this knowledge with my team through regular training sessions. And I encourage them to embrace that continuous learning.
That's a great way to show your commitment to staying up to date. And speaking of technology, let's talk about working with law enforcement, because that's often a big part of a security guard supervisor's job.
Right.
So how might an interviewer ask about that experience?
Well, they might ask something like, can you describe your experience working with law enforcement agencies?
Okay. That seems pretty straightforward.
Hmm.
But is there a way to make your answer stand out?
Well, instead of just saying, I've worked with the police before, you could say something like, I've developed strong relationships with local law enforcement through regular communication and even joint training exercises. And this has fostered a real sense of partnership and mutual understanding, which has been so valuable in situations where we needed their assistance, like the time we apprehended a group of vandals who were damaging property. We worked seamlessly together to ensure a swift and safe resolution.
Okay, so you're emphasizing that collaboration and that effective communication.
Yeah.
But what if things haven't always gone smoothly? What if they ask about disagreements you've had with law enforcement?
Well, that's a tough one, but it's bound to come up. So be prepared to share an example where you had to, navigate a difference of opinion. And the key here is to focus on your communication and conflict resolution skills. You could say something like, in one instance, there was a disagreement about the jurisdiction of an incident, but I respectfully presented our perspective, actively listened to theirs, and ultimately we collaborated to find a solution that addressed both of our concerns.
Okay, so diplomacy is key. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about something really cool that RoleCatcher offers. Their AI can actually analyze job descriptions and then tailor your answers to those specific roles, which seems like a total game changer for interview prep.
It is. It really is. It's like having a personal interview coach in your pocket. It can identify the key skills and experience that the employer is looking for, and then suggest ways to tailor your answers to highlight those strengths.
That's incredible. So it's not about giving those generic answers. It's about really making sure your answers are relevant.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just content. It can even give you feedback on your delivery, help you refine your tone, your pace, your body language.
Wow. Like having a virtual mock interview.
Okay, I think we've covered some really great ground on those leadership and teamwork questions. But let's move on to some other crucial areas for a security guard supervisor role, like
Yeah, let's dive into that.
security assessments. That feels like a really key part of the job. Being proactive and identifying those potential vulnerabilities. How would an interviewer ask about that?
Yeah, they're going to want to know that you're not just reacting to problems, you're actually out there looking for them before they even happen. So a good question might be something like, can you describe your approach to conducting security assessments and identifying potential vulnerabilities?
Okay, so they want to know you're not just, sitting around waiting for something to happen. You're actually out there being proactive.
Right. You want to have a system. You want to be detail-oriented. So instead of just saying, I look for weaknesses, you could actually describe your process.
Give me an example. Okay, so you could say something like, well, I start by conducting a thorough walkthrough of the property, and I take note of any physical vulnerabilities like broken locks, inadequate lighting, unsecured access points, and then I'll review security logs and incident reports to kind of identify any patterns or trends that might suggest potential risks. And finally, I like to use technology, things like CCTV footage analysis software, to identify any blind spots or areas that might need increased surveillance.
Wow, that's really impressive. You're combining technology, physical inspections, data analysis, That's a really comprehensive approach. But
Right.
what if they want a specific example? Like, have you ever identified a vulnerability and how did you address it?
Right. Well, in that case, you need to be ready with a story from your experience. So, for example, maybe you discovered a faulty door sensor during a routine check. You could say, during a perimeter check, I noticed that a door sensor was malfunctioning, and I knew that could potentially allow unauthorized access. So I immediately reported the issue to maintenance, made sure it was repaired promptly, and then in the meantime, I implemented a temporary security patrol in that area just to eliminate that vulnerability until the sensor was fixed.
So you found the problem and you took immediate action to fix it. I like it. Okay, let's talk about something that's constantly changing in the security world. Technology. I bet interviewers really want to know how comfortable you are with things like CCTV and all these other security systems.
Oh, yeah, for sure. A very common question is going to be, can you describe your experience working with CCTV and other security technology?
Okay, so be specific. Don't just say, I know how to use cameras.
Right, exactly. Name the systems you've used. Have you worked with IP cameras, access control systems, intrusion detection systems? You want to be able to say something like, I'm proficient in operating and monitoring various CCTV systems, including both analog and IP-based cameras. I'm also familiar with access control systems. I've used software to manage keycard access and monitor entry points. And in my previous role, I actually implemented a new intrusion detection system that significantly reduced false alarms and really improved our overall security posture.
Okay, so you're not just familiar with the technology, you've actually implemented it.
Yeah.
And you've seen those positive results. But you know what? If someone listening isn't familiar with all these terms, like what's an access control system?
That's a good point. It's always good to be able to explain things clearly. So you could add something like, access control systems basically use electronic credentials like key cards or fobs to restrict entry to specific areas, which helps enhance security and also track who's entering those sensitive locations.
All right, so you're making it crystal clear. Now let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about those high-pressure situations. How do you respond when things go wrong? What's a good question to ask that would really test someone's decision-making skills under pressure?
Well, a common question is going to be something like, describe your approach to responding to security incidents or emergencies.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have a plan. They want to know that you can think on your feet.
Exactly. So you really want to focus on your process for staying calm, gathering information, and then acting decisively.
What would that sound like in an answer?
You could say something like, my approach is always safety first. I immediately assess the situation, gather information from witnesses or security systems, and then I follow our established protocols for that specific incident. Whether it's a fire, a medical emergency, a security breach, I prioritize clear communication with my team and any relevant authorities, and basically I just make sure that everyone's informed and working together to resolve the situation as safely and effectively as possible.
Okay, so you're very methodical and reassuring. But what if they want a specific example? Like, tell me about a time you had to make a difficult decision during an emergency.
Right. So be ready with a story that highlights your judgment and your ability to think quickly.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, you had to make the call to evacuate a building because of a potential fire.
Okay, that's a good one.
Yeah, you could say. During a routine fire alarm activation, I noticed an unusual smell and some smoke coming from a storage area. And while it could have just been a false alarm, I decided to initiate a partial evacuation of the building, just as a precaution. This ensured everyone's safety while we investigated the source of the smoke, and it turned out to be a faulty electrical panel, which was quickly repaired. But you know my decision to err on the side of caution potentially prevented a much more serious incident.
So you prioritize safety, and you weren't afraid to make that tough call. Now let's talk about discretion and confidentiality, because those are really important qualities in a security guard supervisor.
Absolutely. So the interviewer might ask you something like, can you describe a time when you had to handle a sensitive security issue with discretion and confidentiality?
Okay, so they want to know you can be trusted, you have integrity, you're professional.
Exactly. So choose a situation that shows how you handle sensitive information responsibly.
Yeah.
So for example, maybe you discovered that an employee was suspected of theft.
Okay.
Instead of gossiping or jumping to conclusions, you could say, I was informed by a manager about suspicions of employee theft. So I immediately followed our protocol for conducting an internal investigation. I made sure that all evidence was collected and handled confidentially. I interviewed the relevant individuals discreetly, respecting their privacy while still gathering information. And the investigation ultimately led to the identification of the individual responsible. And then appropriate action was taken. But throughout the process, I maintained strict confidentiality, sharing information only with authorized personnel.
So you followed protocol, you protected everyone's privacy. But how do you balance that confidentiality with transparency within your team?
Right. You could say something like, I believe in being transparent with my team, but I also respect confidentiality. So I would keep them informed about the situation in a general sense, but I wouldn't share specific details that could compromise the investigation or violate anyone's privacy.
Right. Okay, so you're keeping them in the loop, but you're also protecting that sensitive information. Now let's circle back to RoleCatcher's AI for a minute. You mentioned it can help tailor answers to specific jobs. Can you give an example of how that works for a security guard supervisor?
Sure. Let's say a job description really emphasizes experience with those access control systems we talked about.
Okay.
RoleCatcher's AI would pick up on that and suggest that you highlight your experience implementing or managing those systems and might even give you some prompts to help you structure your answer.
So it's like having a personal resume and interview strategist.
Exactly.
But it's not just about what you say, right? It's how you say it too.
Oh, absolutely. Delivery is so important. And that's why RoleCatcher also offers AI-powered feedback on your delivery.
Wow.
You can actually record yourself answering interview questions and get personalized tips on things like your tone of voice, your pacing, your body language.
It's like a virtual mock interview.
Exactly.
I think we've done a really deep dive on those interview questions. But let's not forget that the interview is a two-way street. You should be asking questions too.
Oh, absolutely.
It shows that you're engaged, you're interested.
Yeah.
So what are some good questions to ask in a security guard supervisor interview?
Well, I always think it's good to get a sense of the team you'd be leading. So you could ask something like, can you tell me a little bit about the team I'd be supervising? What are their strengths? What are some areas for growth?
That's a good one. It shows that you're already thinking about the leadership aspect of the role.
Yeah.
What about the company's overall approach to security?
Yeah, that's a great one. You could ask, how would you describe the company's overall approach to security? What are your top priorities?
Okay, so you're trying to see how seriously they take security. And if their values align with yours, what about their expectations for the role?
Yeah, you could ask something like, what are the top priorities for this position in the first 90 days?
Okay, so you're already thinking about making an impact.
Exactly.
Those are all fantastic questions. It really turns the interview into a conversation. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on RoleCatcher's Career Guide for Security Guard Supervisors. It's got so much great information that can really help someone stand out in an interview.
It really does.
What are some of the key takeaways from the guide?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on continuous learning. You know, the security industry is always changing. There are always new threats, new technologies emerging. So it's not enough to just have that basic training. You really need to be constantly updating your knowledge and skills.
The guide also talks about the importance of soft skills, right? Things like communication and interpersonal skills.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You know, security guard supervisors have to interact with so many different people. Their team, property managers, employees, law enforcement officials, even the public. So being able to communicate effectively, build trust, resolve conflicts diplomatically, those are all crucial skills.
And it doesn't sugarcoat the challenges of the job either, right?
No, not at all. It acknowledges that this is a high-stress job. You might face dangerous situations. You're going to have to deal with difficult people.
So it's not for everyone.
Right. But the guide does offer some advice on how to manage that stress, how to maintain work-life balance, and where to seek support when you need it.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Think about the future of security with all this new technology coming out, like AI, robotics, biometrics. How do you see the role of a security guard supervisor changing in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. I mean, the security landscape is definitely changing so rapidly. I mean, we're already seeing AI being used for things like facial recognition and threat detection, and robotics are being deployed for tasks like patrolling and surveillance. And then you've got biometrics becoming more and more sophisticated for access control and identity verification.
Right, so how do all these advancements impact the human element of security? Like what kind of skills are security guard supervisors going to need to be successful in this, tech-driven future?
Well, technology is definitely becoming more prevalent, but the human element is always going to be crucial. So these supervisors, they're going to need to be tech savvy. They're going to need to understand how to operate and manage these new systems, but they're also going to need to develop those critical thinking skills. problem-solving skills, so that they can interpret all this information that these systems are providing.
So it's like being a detective, but with these high-tech tools at your disposal.
Exactly. And they're also going to need to be adaptable, quick learners, because technology is constantly changing. And maybe most importantly, they're going to need really strong leadership and communication skills, because they're going to have to manage and train their teams. And their teams are also going to need to adapt to all these changes.
So it's not just about, embracing the technology. It's about understanding how to use it to make things more secure,
Yeah.
but still valuing that human element.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Well, I think we've really covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the key responsibilities of a security guard supervisor, explored some common interview questions, and even looked ahead to the future of the profession.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone about all those incredible resources RoleCatcher offers. Their AI-powered platform can really help you prepare for your interview. Tailor your answers, refine your delivery, build your confidence.
Yeah, preparation is key.
And remember, you're not just applying for a job here.
Yeah.
You're stepping into a leadership role. Your decisions are going to have a real impact on people's safety and security.
That's right.
It's a challenging role, but it can be very rewarding.
Absolutely.
So with the right preparation and the right mindset, you can definitely excel as a security guard supervisor. Good luck out there, everyone.